I never mentioned the cameras I quietly set up at home. Instead of asking questions, I chose to watch in silence. What I saw that night left me stunned. My name is Leon Parker, and I'm 36 years old. I work as a logistics planner for a mid-sized distribution company in suburban Maryland. My job is all about precision, timing, and seeing patterns others miss. I coordinate shipments, track inventory, and solve problems before they become disasters. It's methodical work that requires patience and attention to detail, skills that would prove invaluable in the coming weeks. My wife, Brittany, is 34 and works as a freelance brand coordinator. She helps small businesses develop their marketing strategies and social media presence. At least, that's what she tells everyone. Lately, I've been wondering if her brand coordination involves more personal services than I initially understood. We live in Meadowbrook Estates, one of those upper-middle-class neighborhoods where everyone knows everyone else's business, and the Homeowners Association has opinions about everything from lawn height to mailbox colors. Our house is a colonial-style 4-bedroom with a 2-car garage and a basement that I've converted into my home office. It's where I handle the logistics of our household finances, plan our vacations, and lately, where I've been spending more time trying to figure out what's wrong with my marriage. The problem started about 3 months ago. Brittany began taking phone calls in private, stepping out onto the back deck or disappearing into our bedroom and closing the door. When I asked about it, she'd wave me off with explanations about difficult clients or confidential strategy sessions. Fair enough, I understood professional discretion. But then came the late-night meetings. Brittany would announce over dinner that she had to meet a client at 8 or 9 in the evening, sometimes as late as 10 o'clock. Brand strategy doesn't follow business hours, she'd explain, grabbing her purse and heading for the door. These entrepreneurs work around their day jobs, so I have to be flexible. I wanted to believe her. Marriage is built on trust, and I'd never been the jealous type. But something felt off. The timing was too convenient, the explanations too rehearsed. And there was something in her eyes when she looked at me lately, a distance that hadn't been there before. The final straw came 2 weeks ago when our packages started disappearing. 3 deliveries in 1 week vanished from our front porch, including an expensive set of kitchen knives Brittany had ordered. She was furious, demanding I do something about the theft problem. That's when I installed the security cameras. I told Brittany I was setting up a basic system to catch the package thieves. 2 cameras covering the front entrance, 1 for the back door, and 1 in the living room to monitor the main floor. Nothing in private areas like bedrooms or bathrooms. I'm not a creep. Just common areas where a burglar or package thief might be caught on film. Finally, Brittany said when I showed her the cameras. Maybe now we can catch whoever's stealing our stuff. What I didn't tell her was that the cameras were higher quality than necessary for catching petty thieves. They had night vision, motion activation, and cloud storage backup. They could capture clear footage in low light conditions, and they recorded continuously to a hidden drive in my basement office. I also didn't mention that I could monitor them remotely from my phone. The first week of surveillance was boring. Normal comings and goings, delivery trucks, neighbors walking their dogs. Brittany stuck to her usual routine, working from her home office during the day, running errands in the afternoon, cooking dinner with me in the evening. But last Tuesday changed everything. Brittany announced at dinner that she had a late meeting with a potential client. New restaurant owner in Annapolis, she explained, twirling pasta around her fork. She can only meet after her dinner rush, so I'll probably be out until 11 or so. Want me to wait up? I asked. Don't bother. You have that early conference call with the West Coast warehouse, right? Get your sleep. She was right about the conference call. I did have an early morning meeting scheduled, but something in her tone made me suspicious. She seemed almost eager for me to go to bed early, to be safely unconscious while she was out. After she left at 8:30, I settled into my basement office with my laptop and pulled up the camera feeds. Force of habit, really. I'd been checking them periodically since installation, more out of curiosity than suspicion. At first, everything looked normal, Empty living room, quiet front entrance, peaceful back deck. I worked on some logistics reports for my morning meeting, occasionally glancing at the camera windows on my second monitor. At 10:15 p.m., motion sensors triggered on the front entrance camera. But it wasn't Brittany coming home. It was someone approaching our front door from the street. A man I recognized immediately, Eddie Rusk, our neighbor from 3 houses down. Eddie was married to Melissa, a quiet woman who worked as a nurse at the local hospital. He served as treasurer for our homeowners association and was known for his opinions about property values and neighborhood standards. I watched Eddie look around nervously before pressing our doorbell. 30 seconds later, our front door opened. Brittany appeared, wearing a black dress I'd never seen before. She smiled at Eddie, said something I couldn't hear through the camera audio, and stepped aside to let him in. My stomach dropped. I switched to the living room camera and watched my wife lead our married neighbor to the couch. She poured 2 glasses of wine from a bottle that hadn't been open when she left. They sat close together, talking and laughing. Eddie's hand rested on Brittany's knee. I sat frozen in my basement office, watching my marriage dissolve on a computer screen. After 20 minutes of conversation and wine, Brittany stood and extended her hand to Eddie. He took it, and she led him toward the stairs, toward our bedroom. The living room camera couldn't follow them upstairs, but it didn't need to. I understood exactly what was happening above my head while I sat in the dark, watching empty rooms and trying to process what I'd just witnessed. They came back downstairs an hour later. Eddie looked relaxed, satisfied. Brittany was fixing her hair and smoothing her dress. They shared another glass of wine, talking quietly. At midnight, Eddie left through the front door, again looking around carefully before walking back toward his house. Brittany cleaned up the wine glasses, turned off the lights, and went upstairs. She came home 20 minutes later, using her key to enter through the front door. She called out, "I'm back!" as if she'd just returned from her client meeting in Annapolis. I heard her moving around upstairs, getting ready for bed. I sat in my basement office until 3 in the morning, staring at the recorded footage and trying to decide what to do next. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I lay in bed next to Brittany, listening to her breathe and thinking about logistics. In my line of work, when you discover a problem, you don't react emotionally. You gather data, analyze patterns, and develop a systematic response. Brittany's affair with Eddie Rusk wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was a logistics problem that required careful planning to solve. The next morning, Brittany acted completely normal. She made coffee, kissed my cheek goodbye, and reminded me about dinner plans with her sister on Friday. If I hadn't seen the footage myself, I would never have suspected anything unusual had happened. "How was your client meeting?" I asked over breakfast, testing her. "Productive," she replied without hesitation. "The restaurant owner is really ambitious. She wants to completely rebrand and expand into catering. It'll be a big project if she decides to hire me." The lie came so easily, so naturally, that I wondered how long this had been going on. How many client meetings had actually been sessions with Eddie Rusk? How many times had I wished her luck on her way out the door, unknowingly sending her off to sleep with our neighbor? At work that day, I couldn't concentrate on shipping schedules and inventory reports. My mind kept returning to the camera footage, analyzing every detail. Eddie's nervous glances before entering our house suggested this wasn't their first meeting. Brittany's preparation, the dress I'd never seen, the wine bottle ready to open, indicated planning and premeditation. This wasn't a spontaneous mistake or a moment of weakness. This was an ongoing affair, carefully orchestrated and deliberately hidden. During my lunch break, I called my friend Tyrell Jacobs, who works in our warehouse operations. Tyrell is 30 years old, built like a linebacker, and has a talent for seeing through people's bullshit. He's also one of the most loyal people I know. "Leon, my man," Tyrell answered on the second ring. "What's up? You sound weird." "I need a favor," I said. "Can you help me move some stuff this weekend? Heavy boxes, Need to reorganize my basement storage. Sure thing. Everything okay? Just some household logistics, I replied. I'll explain when I see you. Tyrell agreed to come over Saturday morning. I didn't tell him the real reason I needed help. I was planning to move important documents, backup drives, and valuables to a more secure location. If Brittany was planning to leave me for Eddie, I wanted to make sure our financial records and my personal property were protected. That evening, I reviewed the camera footage again, this time taking detailed notes. I documented timestamps, behaviors, and conversations I could lip read. I saved multiple copies of the video files to different drives, including a cloud storage account Brittany didn't know about. Then I started researching Eddie Rusk. As HOA treasurer, Eddie had access to neighborhood financial records and homeowner contact information. He lived in a house worth approximately $50,000 more than ours, drove a BMW sedan, and worked as a sales manager for a pharmaceutical company. His wife Melissa worked night shifts at the hospital, which explained why she wasn't home when Eddie visited our house. I pulled up our HOA directory and found Melissa's work schedule listed in the emergency contact information. She worked 12-hour shifts, Tuesday through Thursday nights, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. Eddie's visits to our house coincided perfectly with her work schedule. The planning involved was almost impressive. Eddie and Brittany had identified a 3-day window each week when Melissa would be at the hospital and I would be asleep early due to my West Coast conference calls. They'd turned my wife's client meetings into a regular appointment for adultery. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated my attention to detail. Over the next week, I continued my surveillance without letting Brittany know I suspected anything. I documented 2 more visits from Eddie, both following the same pattern. Tuesday and Thursday nights, Melissa at work, Eddie arriving at our house around 10 p.m. and leaving after midnight, Brittany returning home 20 minutes later with stories about client meetings. I also started making discreet preparations for what I was beginning to think of as Operation Cleanup. First, I separated our finances. I opened a new checking account at a different bank and began redirecting my paycheck deposits. I changed passwords on all accounts where I was the primary holder. I made copies of important documents, mortgage papers, insurance policies, tax returns, and stored them in a safety deposit box Brittany didn't know about. Second, I researched divorce law in Maryland. I wanted to understand my rights and options before making any confrontational moves. What I learned was encouraging. Maryland is a no-fault divorce state, but adultery is still considered grounds for divorce and can influence property distribution and alimony decisions. Video evidence of adultery would be very useful in divorce proceedings. Third, I started documenting Brittany's lies. I kept a detailed log of her claimed client meetings versus her actual activities. I saved text messages where she mentioned work commitments that I knew were false. I was building a case piece by piece, like organizing a complex logistics operation. The breakthrough came the following Tuesday. I was monitoring the cameras from my office when Eddie arrived for his regular appointment. But this time, I decided to gather additional evidence. I drove home during my lunch break the next day and checked our bedroom for signs of the affair. What I found was a drawer in Brittany's dresser containing items I'd never seen before. Expensive lingerie with tags still attached, a bottle of perfume I didn't recognize, and a burner phone with text messages between B and E dating back 3 months. The text messages were explicit and detailed. They discussed their weekly meetings, complained about their respective spouses, and made plans for a future together. One message from Eddie particularly caught my attention. Melissa's picking up extra shifts next month. More time for us. Can't wait to make this permanent. They weren't just having an affair. They were planning to leave their marriages. I photographed everything with my phone, then carefully returned the items to their original positions. Brittany would never know I'd found her secret drawer, but I now had evidence of premeditation and long-term planning. That evening, Brittany announced another client meeting for Thursday night. Same restaurant owner? I asked. No, this is a new prospect. a boutique fitness studio owner who wants to expand her social media presence. She can only meet after her evening classes. Another lie, delivered with the same casual confidence as all the others. I smiled and wished her luck. Saturday morning, Tyrell arrived at my house with his pickup truck and a questioning look. Brittany was out running errands, which gave us privacy to work. "All right, Leon," Tyrell said as we headed down to my basement office. "What's really going on here? You've been acting strange all week." I showed him the camera footage. Tyrell watched in silence as Eddie Rusk entered our house and left with my wife. When the video ended, he sat back in his chair and shook his head. "Damn, man. I'm sorry. That's rough." "I need your help," I said. "Not for anything illegal or violent, just some strategic logistics." I explained my plan. Tyrell would help me install a more secure lock on my basement office and move sensitive documents to a fireproof safe I'd purchased. We'd also set up a backup storage unit where I could keep important items if I needed to leave the house quickly. "You're not going to confront her?" Tyrell asked. "Not yet. I want to be completely prepared first. In logistics, timing is everything." Tyrell grinned. "You're going to destroy them, aren't you?" "I'm going to protect myself," I corrected. "What happens to them is a consequence of their own choices." We spent the morning securing my basement office and moving valuables to the storage unit. Tyrell also helped me install a hidden camera in our garage, positioned to capture the license plates of any vehicles that parked in our driveway. If Eddie was visiting regularly, I wanted complete documentation. That afternoon, I made a decision that would change everything. I created an anonymous email account and sent a message to Melissa Rusk at the hospital where she worked. The message was simple and direct. "Mrs. Rusk, you don't know me, but I have information about your husband that you need to see. I'm sending this because I would want someone to tell me if I were in your situation. Please check your personal email when you get home from work tonight." I attached 3 video files showing Eddie entering and leaving my house, along with screenshots of the text messages between him and Brittany. I didn't identify myself or explain how I'd obtained the evidence. I just provided the facts and let Melissa draw her own conclusions. Then I waited. Melissa worked Thursday night, which meant she wouldn't see the email until Friday morning. Eddie and Brittany had one more scheduled rendezvous before their world collapsed. Thursday evening played out exactly as expected. Brittany announced another client meeting. Eddie arrived at 10:15 p.m., and they spent an hour upstairs before sharing wine and conversation in our living room. I watched from my basement office, taking notes and saving additional video files. But this time I also activated the new garage camera to capture Eddie's BMW in our driveway. The license plate was clearly visible, providing additional evidence of his presence at our house. Friday morning, I went to work early and waited for the explosion. It came at 11:30 a.m. in the form of a phone call to our house that I could hear through the security cameras. Brittany was in her home office when the phone rang. I watched her answer with her usual cheerful, "Hello, this is Brittany." Her expression changed immediately. The color drained from her face, and she sat down heavily in her chair. I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but Brittany's responses told me everything I needed to know. "I don't know what you're talking about. That's not... How did you... No, please. Let me explain." The call lasted 15 minutes. When it ended, Brittany immediately tried calling someone, probably Eddie. When that call went to voicemail, she tried again and again. I smiled and returned to my logistics reports. At lunch, I drove by Eddie's house and saw Melissa's car in the driveway, along with 2 suitcases on the front lawn. A handwritten sign taped to the front door read, "Cheating husband, take your stuff and go." Eddie's BMW was nowhere to be seen. That evening, Brittany was waiting for me when I got home from work. She looked like she'd been crying, and her usual confidence was completely gone. "Leon, we need to talk," she said. "About what?" I asked, hanging up my coat and heading for the kitchen. About some rumors that are going around the neighborhood. Someone's been spreading lies about me and Eddie Rusk. I opened the refrigerator and pulled out ingredients for dinner. What kind of lies? They're saying we're having an affair. It's completely ridiculous, but Melissa Rusk believes it. She kicked Eddie out of their house today. That's terrible, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Why would someone make up something like that? Brittany watched me carefully, looking for signs that I knew more than I was letting on. I don't know. Maybe someone has it out for Eddie because of his HOA position. You know how political these neighborhood things can get. I started chopping vegetables for a salad. Have you talked to Eddie about it? He's not answering his phone. I think he's pretty upset about the whole situation. I'm sure he is, I agreed. Being falsely accused of adultery must be devastating. Brittany flinched at the word adultery, but pressed on. The thing is, these rumors could really hurt my business. If potential clients think I'm unprofessional or untrustworthy, then you should probably address them directly, I suggested. Set the record straight. How do you suggest I do that? I looked up from my chopping and met her eyes. Tell the truth, Brittany. It's always the best policy. She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her trying to figure out how much I knew, but I kept my expression neutral and returned to preparing dinner. I think I'll go stay with my sister for a few days, Brittany said finally, until this whole thing blows over. That's probably smart, I agreed. Give the neighborhood gossip something else to talk about. She went upstairs to pack, and I continued making dinner for one. Brittany left for her sister's house that evening, taking 2 suitcases and promising to call me in a few days. I helped her load her car and kissed her goodbye, playing the role of the supportive husband dealing with unfair neighborhood gossip. As soon as her taillights disappeared around the corner, I returned to my basement office and began Phase 2 of Operation Cleanup. I'd been researching our homeowners association bylaws, and I'd discovered something interesting. The HOA had a morality clause that prohibited conduct detrimental to the community's reputation and property values. Adultery between neighbors could be considered a violation of this clause, especially when one of the participants served as an elected HOA official. Eddie Rusk wasn't just a cheating husband. He was a treasurer who'd violated his fiduciary duty to maintain community standards. I prepared a formal complaint to submit to the HOA board, complete with video evidence and documentation of Eddie's misconduct. I didn't mention Brittany specifically in the complaint, focusing instead on Eddie's abuse of his position and his violation of community trust. The complaint was submitted anonymously through the HOA's online portal Saturday morning. By Saturday afternoon, the neighborhood gossip network was in overdrive. I took a walk around Meadowbrook Estates and overheard at least 3 different conversations about the Rusk situation. Details were spreading and evolving as they passed from house to house. Some versions had Eddie caught in bed with a neighbor's wife. Others claimed he'd been embezzling HOA funds to pay for hotel rooms. One particularly creative version suggested he'd been running an escort service out of the community clubhouse. The truth was damaging enough, but the rumors were destroying what remained of Eddie's reputation. Sunday evening, I received a phone call from Janet Morrison, the HOA president. "Leon, I hope you don't mind me calling on a weekend," Janet said. "But we've received some serious allegations about Eddie Rusk, and we need to schedule an emergency board meeting." "What kind of allegations?" I asked, playing ignorant. Without going into details, there are questions about his conduct as treasurer and his compliance with community standards. The board needs to review the evidence and decide how to proceed. That sounds serious. It is. We're scheduling a special meeting for Tuesday evening at 7 p.m. in the clubhouse. All homeowners are invited to attend, given the nature of the allegations. I thanked Janet for the call and marked my calendar. Tuesday evening was going to be very interesting. Monday morning, I got a text message from Brittany. "Coming home today. We need to talk." She arrived Monday afternoon while I was at work, and she was waiting in the living room when I got home. She looked tired and stressed, but there was something different in her demeanor, a hardness that hadn't been there before. "I know it was you," she said without preamble. I'm sorry? The evidence that Melissa received, the HOA complaint, all of it. You're the only one who could have put this together. I sat down across from her and maintained eye contact. I don't know what you're talking about, Brittany. Don't lie to me, Leon. I found the cameras. My stomach tightened, but I kept my expression neutral. What cameras? The security cameras you installed. I know they're more sophisticated than you told me. I know you've been watching everything. She was fishing, trying to get me to admit what I knew. But I'd spent years in logistics, learning to keep my cards close to my chest during negotiations. The cameras are for security, I said calmly. After the package thefts, remember? Cut the crap, Leon. I know you saw Eddie and me together. I know you sent that evidence to Melissa and the HOA. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at our quiet suburban street. Brittany, if you have something you want to tell me, I'm listening. I want to know what you want. What I want? To keep quiet, to make this go away. What's your price? I turned back to face her, genuinely surprised by the question. My price? Money? The house? What do you want in exchange for backing off? For the first time since this whole situation began, I felt genuinely angry. Not hurt, not betrayed. Angry. Brittany thought she could negotiate her way out of the consequences of her choices. She thought this was just another business transaction. I want the truth, I said quietly. What truth? How long has this been going on? How long have you been sleeping with Eddie Rusk while lying to my face? Brittany's composure cracked slightly. Leon. How long, Brittany? She looked away. 3 months. Were you planning to leave me for him? A longer pause. We talked about it. And you decided to what? Keep lying until you figured out the logistics of your exit strategy? It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. No, I imagine it wasn't. You probably thought you could manage the situation, control the narrative, make a clean transition when it was convenient for you. Leon, please, we can work this out. No, I said firmly. We can't. You made your choice 3 months ago. Now you get to live with the consequences. Brittany's expression hardened again. If you think you can destroy my life and walk away clean, you're wrong. I have friends in this neighborhood. I have clients who trust me. I can make things very difficult for you. You're welcome to try, I replied. But you might want to focus on the HOA meeting tomorrow night first. Her face went pale. What HOA meeting? Emergency board meeting. Tuesday at 7, all homeowners invited. Something about reviewing allegations against Eddie Rusk. Brittany stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her calculating options and outcomes. Finally, she grabbed her purse and headed for the door. This isn't over, Leon. Yes, I said quietly. It is. Tuesday evening, the Meadowbrook Estates Community Clubhouse was packed with more residents than I'd ever seen at an HOA meeting. Word had spread about the emergency allegations against Eddie Rusk, and everyone wanted to witness the drama firsthand. I arrived 15 minutes early and took a seat in the back row, where I could observe without drawing attention. Tyrell had offered to come for moral support, but I'd declined. This wasn't about confrontation. It was about letting the community see the truth and draw their own conclusions. Janet Morrison called the meeting to order at exactly 7 p.m. She looked uncomfortable as she addressed the packed room. Thank you all for coming tonight. We're here to address serious allegations that have been brought to the board's attention regarding the conduct of our treasurer, Eddie Rusk. A murmur went through the crowd. I spotted several neighbors I recognized, all leaning forward in anticipation. Before we begin, Janet continued, I want to remind everyone that this is a formal HOA proceeding. We will conduct ourselves with dignity and respect, regardless of the nature of the allegations. Eddie Rusk was sitting in the front row, looking like he'd aged 5 years in the past week. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by the hunched posture of a man who knew his world was collapsing. Brittany was nowhere to be seen. Janet opened a manila folder and began reading from the anonymous complaint I'd submitted. The formal language made the accusation sound even more damning. The complainant alleges that Mr. Edward Rusk, while serving as elected treasurer of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, engaged in conduct detrimental to community standards and property values, specifically by conducting an extramarital affair with a neighbor while using his HOA position to access personal information about residents' schedules and contact details. The murmur in the room grew louder. Several people turned to look at Eddie, who was staring at his hands. The complainant has provided video evidence and documentation supporting these allegations, Janet continued. The board has reviewed this evidence and determined that it meets the threshold for a formal hearing. She nodded to the AV volunteer, a teenager who'd been recruited to run the projector for HOA presentations. Please display Exhibit A. The lights dimmed, and the video began playing on the large screen at the front of the room. It was the footage from our front entrance camera, showing Eddie approaching our door and being welcomed inside by Brittany. The timestamp clearly showed the date and time, Tuesday, 10:15 p.m. The room was completely silent except for the sound of Eddie's sharp intake of breath. The video continued, showing Eddie leaving our house an hour and 15 minutes later, again looking around nervously before walking back toward his own home. Exhibit B, Janet announced. The second video showed the same pattern on Thursday night. Eddie arriving, being welcomed by Brittany, staying for over an hour, and leaving with the satisfied expression of a man who'd gotten what he came for. By the time the third video finished playing, several residents were shaking their heads in disgust. I heard someone whisper, "Unbelievable," and another person mutter, "His poor wife." The complainant has also provided documentation showing that these visits coincided with Mrs. Rusk's work schedule at the hospital, Janet continued. This suggests premeditation and planning, rather than spontaneous encounters. Eddie finally stood up, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "This is a violation of privacy," he said, his voice shaking. "Whoever recorded these videos did so without consent. This evidence should be inadmissible." "Mr. Rusk," Janet replied calmly, "the videos were recorded on private property by the homeowner for security purposes. The HOA has consulted with our legal counsel, and we've been advised that the evidence is admissible for the purposes of this hearing. I demand to know who filed this complaint," Eddie continued. "I have a right to face my accuser. The complaint was filed anonymously, which is permitted under our bylaws. The identity of the complainant is not relevant to the substance of the allegations." Eddie looked around the room, his eyes scanning the faces of his neighbors. When his gaze reached me, I maintained neutral eye contact. He had no way of knowing I was responsible, but I could see suspicion in his expression. "The board has also received character references regarding this matter," Janet announced. "Mrs. Melissa Rusk has submitted a written statement confirming the breakdown of her marriage due to her husband's infidelity. She has also provided additional evidence, including text messages between Mr. Rusk and his paramour, that corroborate the timeline presented in the complaint." She held up a thick folder. These text messages detail the planning and execution of the affair, including discussions about using Mr. Rusk's access to HOA records to coordinate their meetings around Mrs. Rusk's work schedule. The crowd was getting restless. I could hear angry muttering and see people shaking their heads in disapproval. Eddie had violated not just his marriage vows, but the trust of his entire community. "Furthermore," Janet continued, "the board has discovered irregularities in Mr. Rusk's handling of HOA financial records. While we have found no evidence of embezzlement, Mr. Rusk appears to have used his treasurer access to review the personal information of homeowners without legitimate business reasons." This was news to me. Apparently, the board's investigation had uncovered additional misconduct beyond what I'd documented. "Based on the evidence presented," Janet announced, The board has voted to immediately remove Mr. Edward Rusk from his position as treasurer and to ban him from holding any HOA office in the future. We are also implementing a formal censure that will be included in his homeowner file and disclosed to any future buyers if he chooses to sell his property. Eddie stood up abruptly. You can't do this. I'll sue the association. I'll sue whoever filed this complaint. This is defamation and harassment. Mr. Rusk, Janet said firmly, you are welcome to pursue whatever legal remedies you feel are appropriate. However, the evidence against you is substantial and well documented. I would suggest you consult with an attorney before making any threats you cannot substantiate. Eddie stormed out of the meeting, slamming the clubhouse door behind him. The room erupted in conversation as soon as he left. I remained seated, listening to my neighbors discuss what they'd just witnessed. The consensus was clear. Eddie had betrayed his wife, his position, and his community. There was no sympathy for his situation. After the meeting ended, I walked home slowly, taking time to process what had just happened. The first phase of my plan was complete. Eddie's reputation was destroyed, his marriage was over, and his standing in the community was permanently damaged. But Brittany's reckoning was still to come. I found Brittany waiting in our living room when I returned from the HOA meeting. She was sitting on the same couch where she'd entertained Eddie Rusk, holding a glass of wine and wearing an expression of cold fury. Enjoy the show? She asked. It was informative, I replied, hanging up my jacket. You destroyed him completely. Are you satisfied? I looked at her carefully. There was no remorse in her voice, no acknowledgement of her role in Eddie's downfall. She was angry that her affair had been exposed, not sorry that it had happened. Eddie destroyed himself, I said. I just documented it. Don't give me that passive bullshit, Leon. You orchestrated this whole thing, the cameras, the evidence, the HOA complaint, all of it. I sat down across from her, maintaining the same neutral expression I'd worn throughout this entire ordeal. What do you want, Brittany? I want to know what happens next. Are you planning to divorce me, kick me out, ruin my business like you ruined Eddie's life? That depends. On what? On whether you're capable of telling me the truth. Brittany took a long sip of wine and studied my face. What do you want to know? Everything. How it started, how long it's been going on, what you were planning for our future. She was quiet for several minutes, and I could see her weighing her options. Finally, she seemed to make a decision. It started 4 months ago at an HOA social event, she began. Eddie and I were talking about neighborhood property values, and he mentioned that he thought our house had good investment potential. We started texting about real estate and then about other things. What other things? Our marriages, how we both felt stuck, underappreciated. Eddie said Melissa had become distant since she started working nights. I told him you'd become boring and predictable. The words stung, but I kept my expression neutral. When did it become physical? 3 months ago. Eddie invited me to see a house he was considering as an investment property. Nothing happened that day, but there was tension between us. The next week, he texted me during one of Melissa's night shifts. And you invited him over? Yes. How many times? Brittany hesitated. Twice a week, usually. Sometimes 3 times if Melissa picked up extra shifts. I did the math quickly. Assuming an average of 2 meetings per week over 3 months, Brittany had betrayed our marriage approximately 24 times. Each instance had required planning, deception, and elaborate lies about client meetings. Were you planning to leave me for him? Another pause. We talked about it. Eddie said he was going to ask Melissa for a divorce after the holidays. He wanted to wait until after his daughter's graduation in the spring. And you were willing to wait? I was willing to see how things developed. The clinical way she described dismantling our marriage was almost impressive. Brittany had been treating our relationship like a business merger, weighing options and managing timelines. Did you ever consider just asking me for a divorce directly? I asked. I thought about it, but I wasn't sure what I wanted long term. Eddie was exciting, but he's also impulsive and not particularly stable financially. So you decided to keep your options open. I decided to explore my feelings before making any permanent decisions. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street where Eddie Rusk had walked so many times on his way to sleep with my wife. The thing is, Brittany, I said without turning around, you did make a permanent decision. You made it the first time you invited Eddie into our house. Everything that's happened since then has just been the logical consequence of that choice. Leon, please. I know I made mistakes, but we can work through this. Couples recover from affairs all the time. I turned back to face her. Do you love him? I thought I did. But after seeing how he handled the pressure this week, how quickly he fell apart when things got difficult, I realize he's not the man I thought he was. And do you love me? Brittany looked down at her wine glass. I don't know. I think I stopped loving both of us somewhere along the way. It was the first completely honest thing she'd said since this conversation began. Then we're done, I said simply. Just like that? Just like that. I walked to my briefcase and pulled out a manila envelope I'd prepared earlier that day. Inside were divorce papers I'd had drawn up by a lawyer, along with a comprehensive financial settlement proposal. You'll find this is quite generous, I told her, handing over the envelope. I'm not interested in a prolonged legal battle or public drama. You can keep your car, your business equipment, and half of our savings. I'll keep the house and my retirement accounts. Brittany opened the envelope and scanned the documents. This is already prepared. You've been planning this. I've been preparing for multiple scenarios. This seemed like the most likely outcome once you made your position clear. What if I don't sign? Then we'll go through the court system, and all of this becomes public record. The video evidence, the text messages, the documentation of your deception, it all gets presented to a judge who will decide our financial settlement. Brittany understood the implication immediately. A contested divorce would expose her affair to her clients, her family, and anyone else who cared to look up the court records. You've thought of everything, haven't you? She said. It's what I do for a living. She closed the envelope and stood up. I'll need time to review this with a lawyer. Of course. Take all the time you need. Brittany headed toward the stairs, then stopped and turned back to me. For what it's worth, Leon, I never meant for it to happen this way. I know, I replied. You meant to manage the situation better. You meant to control the timeline and the outcome. You meant to have more options when everything fell apart. She stared at me for a moment, and I could see her recognizing the man she'd underestimated for so many years. You're not the same person I married, she said. No, I agreed. I'm not. But then again, neither are you. Brittany went upstairs to pack her things. I remained in the living room, finishing the glass of wine she'd abandoned and thinking about logistics. In 3 weeks, I'd transformed from a betrayed husband into a man in complete control of his future. I'd gathered evidence, protected my assets, destroyed my wife's lover, and negotiated a clean exit from a marriage that had become a lie. The logistics of ruin, it turned out, were remarkably similar to the logistics of anything else: careful planning, precise execution, and attention to detail. Brittany left the next morning with 2 suitcases and a promise to have the divorce papers reviewed by the end of the week. I never saw her again. 6 months later, I received the final divorce decree in the mail. Brittany had signed the settlement agreement without modification. Eddie Rusk had moved out of Meadowbrook Estates entirely, selling his house at a significant loss due to the HOA censure disclosure requirement. Melissa Rusk kept their house and received a generous divorce settlement. She sent me a thank you card, acknowledging that my evidence had helped her secure a favorable outcome in her own divorce proceedings. I kept the security cameras, not because I expected any more drama, but because I'd learned the value of documentation. In logistics, in marriage, and in life, it pays to keep accurate records. The house feels different now, quieter, more peaceful. I've converted Brittany's old office into a reading room, And I've started dating a woman named Sarah who works as a nurse at the same hospital as Melissa. She's honest, direct, and appreciates the value of careful planning. We're taking things slowly, building trust gradually, and maintaining clear communication about our expectations and boundaries. In other words, we're applying good logistics to our relationship. Sometimes I think about Brittany and wonder if she ever found what she was looking for. But mostly, I don't think about her at all. She was a problem that required solving, and I solved it with the same methodical approach I bring to every challenge in my life. The logistics of ruin taught me something important. The best revenge isn't emotional or dramatic. It's simply allowing people to experience the natural consequences of their choices, documented clearly and presented without commentary. Truth, it turns out, is the most devastating weapon of all.